Chapter 30 of Darnley by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. So catchers and snatchers do toil both night and day, not needy, but greedy, still prolling for their prey. However a poor novelist may like to pursue the even tenor of his way in peace and quietness, it is quite impossible for him to do so if he take a true story for the basis of his tale. Circumstance is always jumping about, and if he would follow nature, he must join in the game of leapfrog too. Here is the palace of fortune, with its glitter and its splendour and its show, and there the cottage of want, with its care and its foulness and its misery. In one house, new-born life is coming into the world, all joyous. In the next, stern death leads man away to eternity. Weeping sorrow and laughing joy sit mocking each other at every step, and smiles and tears are still running after each other on the high road, though little formed to bear company together. Then, since the world is full of oppositions and of jumps, he that copies it must sit upon his hind legs and play the kangaroo also. I found it necessary to put forth this excuse before proceeding with Vonderbrugius, who, without offering any reason for doing so, suddenly flies back to scenes that we have not long quitted, and brings the reader once more to London, where he shall be detained as short a time as possible on the word of a scribe. All those who have read the history of that little powerful nook of island earth called Great Britain must very well know that the imperious minister of Henry VIII was not one to receive contradiction with patient resignation. What then was his rage on hearing that Lady Constance de Grey was not to be found at Richmond? True to what he threatened, Wolsey had not failed, immediately on arriving in London, to send a horse-litter down to Richmond for his fair ward, notwithstanding the lateness of the hour, and the cold he had himself experienced on the water. And towards 11 the same night his messengers returned, informing him that the lady was not to be found in the palace, adding also that a man belonging to the gate had been employed to carry some luggage for her down to a 2-oared boat, which had received her at the stairs, and rowed off towards Westminster. This was the sum of all the news they had obtained, but it was sufficient to guide Wolsey on the search which he instantly prepared to institute for the fugitive. Before going to rest, he took every precaution for preventing her leaving the kingdom, ordered messengers to set out early the next morning for every port where she was likely to embark, and commanded an officer to post to Richmond that very night, and, stationing himself at the palace stairs to await the arrival of the men who rowed the boat which had conveyed her away, giving him at the same time an order for their arrest. In regard to the couriers to the various ports, we shall leave them to their fate, not embarrassing ourselves with a search half over the realm, but shall pursue the movements of the other messenger, from whose operations very important results were obtained. Though heartily wishing the cardinal and Lady Constance well scourged, the one as the proximate, the other as his remote cause of his night ride, the officer got into his saddle, and, accompanied by 2 followers, set out for Richmond, where they arrived towards 2 o'clock in the morning. Men of curious and philosophic mind have remarked that there is always a pot-house near a waterman's stairs, and the same fact was observable in the present instance. Nearly opposite to the landing on the left-hand side stood the hospitable mansion of a beer retailer, who dealt out the British nectar to all those who had the means of paying for it, and in his window, even at the hour of 2 o'clock, was shining a lamp, whereat the officer marvelled, as the neighbourhood of the palace enjoined order and sobriety amongst the multitude. Riding up, however, he dismounted, and, pushing open the door, perceived that the tap-room was occupied by a single individual of the waterman species, whose sleepy head, nodding backwards and forwards, often approached so near the lamp upon the table as to threaten his red nose with a conflagration. Without any regard for the rites of Morpheus, the officer shook the sleeper heartily by the shoulder, whereupon he started up, crying, "Well, I'm ready. How long you've been! I've been awaiting this hour." "Waiting for whom?" demanded the officer. "Not for me, I'm sure, or with my will you'd waited long enough." "Lord bless us, sir, I beg your worship's pardon," said the man, rubbing his eyes. "I thought you were the two yeomen that hired my boat to take the young lady to Lunnon. Curious folks they were, not to let me row my own boat. They promised to be back by 1, and so Master Tapster lets me sit up here for 'em. I thought you were them two, indeed." "No, I'm a single man, and never was two in my life," answered the officer. "But about these two yeomen. At 1 o'clock you say they were to come? Pray, how came you to let them your boat?" "Lord, because they asked me, sure," replied the waterman. "That's how." "But how do you know they will ever bring it back again?" demanded the officer. "Because they left me 10 marks as a pledge," answered the other. "No, no, I wasn't to be outwitted. I saw they wanted the boat very bad, so I let them have it for a mark by the day, but I made them leave me 10 others. So if the boat be lost or hurt, I've got double its worth in my own pocket." "And what did they say they were going to do with it?" demanded the officer. "Oh, I didn't ask," said the waterman, "but walking about, I saw them lie there at the stairs for near an hour, till presently comes down a young lady, and an old priest, and a waiting woman, as I judged, and in they get, and away they rows the boat toward Lunnon. They were lusty rowers, I warrant you, and good at the trade; but your worship seems mighty curious about them." "Ay, and so curious," answered the officer, "that they shall both come with me to London, if they come hither to-night, and you too, master waterman, so hold yourself ready. Ho, Thomas, come in and stay with this worthy. See that he does not budge. You, Will, put up the horses, and then come down to me at the stairs." The excellent tipstaff now, after cutting short the remonstrance of the boatman, proceeded to the waterside, and crossing his arms, waited, with his eyes fixed upon the bright river, as it flowed on, rippling like waves of silver in the moonshine. In a few minutes he was joined by his follower, and before long a black spot appeared moving up the midst of the stream, while the plashing of distant oars began to make itself heard. As the boat came nearer, 2 men were plainly to be seen rowing it towards the landing place, one of whom, raising his head when they were within a few yards' distance, exclaimed, "Is that you, Master Perkins?" "Ay, ay," answered the officer, imitating, as well as he could, the gruff halloo of a waterman, and walking about with his hands in his breeches pockets, as if to keep himself warm. Without more ado, the boat pulled to the shore, and one of the men jumped out, whereupon the officer instantly caught him by the collar, exclaiming, "In the king's name, I charge you go with me." Pull off," cried the man to his companion. "By the Lord, he has grabbed me. Pull off, boy." The other rower, without scruple, pushed from the shore before the tipstaff's man could secure the bow of the boat, and seeing his companion caught beyond the power of extrication, he snatched up the other oar, and pulled away down the river as hard as he could. "And now, what the devil do you want with me?" cried the man sturdily, turning to the officer. "Come, off with your hands. Don't be fingering my collar so hard, or I'll crack your nutshell for you." And at the same time he struggled to shake off the other's grasp; but the officer, who seemed accustomed to deal with persons that did not particularly relish his ministry, very soon settled the question with his prisoner, by striking him a blow over the head with a staff he carried, in such sort as to level him with the ground. It is wonderful how soothing to the prisoner's feelings this mild treatment seemed to be, for without any further effort he suffered himself to be led away to the ale-house, from whence he was safely removed the next morning to Westminster, the original owner of the boat being carried along with him as a witness. And here let me beg all constables, Bow Street officers, scarlet runners, street keepers, constables of the night, and watchmen, who may read this excellent and instructive history, to take example by the prudence of this officer, who, having acquired all the information he could from other sources, wisely abstained from asking his prisoner any questions whatsoever, leaving his examination to be taken by competent persons. Carrying his game directly to York House, the worthy and exemplary tipstaff, whose name I should not fail to record, had not Vonderbrugius unfeelingly omitted it, this prince of tipstaves, I say, placed his charge in a place of security, and, on the cardinal's return from Westminster Hall, informed him of all that he had done to fulfil the mission with which he had honoured him. The cardinal praised the tipstaff's zeal, and beginning to suspect that there was some mystery in the business, more than the mere course which Constance had taken, he ordered the prisoner and the evidence to be brought instantly before him, and proceeded himself to investigate the matter, and to see whether his fingers would be neat enough to pick the needle out of the bottle of hay; a delicate operation, for which there is but one method, which may be called the Alexandrine, namely, burn the hay, and you are sure to get the needle. Something similar was the proceeding which the cardinal proposed to adopt, for no sooner was the prisoner brought before him, rather pale with fright, and somewhat nervous with his night's entertainment, that he pronounced a most eloquent oration upon the necessity of meeting death with firmness, warning the unhappy man, at the same time, that he had nothing to hope in this world, and bidding him to prepare for the next. Through the whole, however, he suffered to appear, implied, though not expressed, the possibility that a free confession of all the culprit knew concerning Lady Constance de Grey and her evasion might take the sting out of his offence, and disencumber his windpipe of the pressing familiarity with which it was threatened by a hempen cord. In those times rights were but little defined, and the extent of the great civil and political powers hardly ascertained even to the minds of the cultivated and reflecting, much less to people in the rank of the person who now stood before the prelate, surrounded by all those impressive insignia which then indeed implied vast though borrowed power. Without going into the metaphysics of the business, it will be sufficient for my purpose to say, that the poor fellow was desperately frightened, especially as he had upon his conscience more than one hearty crime, which he well knew might at any time prove a sufficient excuse for sending him part of the way to heaven, whether he ever made the whole journey out or not. Therefore, having no great interest in concealing anything he knew, and every interest in the world in telling it, he fell down upon his knees, declaring that he would reveal all, if the cardinal would make a solemn promise that he should have the king's free pardon, and the church's, for every sin, crime, and misdemeanour he had committed up to that day. It cost him nothing but a bit of parchment and a little yellow wax, and so the cardinal promised, whereupon the culprit, still upon his knees, began as follows: "My master, Sir Payan Wileton—" "Sir Payan Wileton is your master, then?" cried Wolsey. So, go on." "My master, Sir Payan Wileton, my gracious lord," continued the man, "after he had been with your grace yesterday morning, returned home full speed to his house by the water's edge, near Tothill, and suddenly dispatched one of our yeomen down to Richmond with a poor foolish priest, saving your grace's presence, who had been with him some days. After that, he wrote a note, and giving it to me, bade me take with me Black John, and gallop down to the court like mad. Whenever I got there, I was to speak with Hatchel Sivard, whom he had set to spy all that passed at the palace, and who would help me to hire a boat for the day. After that was done, I was to seek the Lady de Grey and give her the note, and then, leaving our horses at the baiting house, I and my fellow were to wait in the boat till the lady came, and to row her whithersoever she directed; but, above all, to seem like common watermen, and to take whatever payment she gave us; and if by chance she didn't come, we were to give up the boat and return." As may be supposed, Wolsey was not a little surprised at the intrigue which this opened to his view. "So," said he, "so, Hatchel Sivard, the page of the queen's antechamber, is a pensioned spy of Sir Payan Wileton? Good, very good. Of course you carried the lady to her relation's house, ha?" "Not so, may it please your lordship's grace," replied the man. "At first, she made as if she would have stopped at Tothill, but then she bade us row on to Westminster, where she landed." "But you saw whither she went?" cried Wolsey, his brow darkening. "Mind, your life depends upon your speaking truth. Let me but see a shade of falsehood, and you are lost." "As I hope for mercy, my lord, I tell you the whole truth," replied the servant. "When she was landed, I got out and followed; but, after turning through several streets, I saw that they marked me watching, so I was obliged to run down a narrow lane, hoping to catch them by going round; but they had taken some other way, and I found them not again." Wolsey let his hand drop heavily upon the table, disappointed in his expectations. "You say them, fellow? Whom do you mean?" he demanded. "Who was with her?" "Her waiting woman, your grace," answered the man, "and an old priest, whom Sivard says is her chaplain." "Ah!" said Wolsey thoughtfully. "Dr. Wilbraham, this is very strange. A staid, good man, obedient to my will, coinciding in the expediency of the marriage I proposed. There must be some deeper plot here of this Sir Payan Wileton. The poor girl must be deceived, and perhaps not so much obstinate as misled. I see it all. The wily traitor seeks her estates, and would fain both stop her marriage and bring her within my displeasure. A politic scheme, upon my honour, but it shall not succeed. Secretary, bid an usher speed to Sir Payan Wileton, and, greeting him sweetly, request his presence for a moment here." It was the latter part of the above speech only that met the ears of those around, the rest being muttered to himself in a low and almost inaudible tone. "Pray, your lordship's grace," cried the man, clasping his hands in terror as soon as he heard Wolsey's command, "do not let Sir Payan have me. I shall not be alive this time 2 days, if you do. Indeed I shan't. Your grace does not know him. There is nothing stops him in his will, and I shall be found dead in my bed, or drowned in a pond, or tumbled out of a window, or something like. And then Sir Payan will pretend to make an investigation, and have the crowner, and it will be found all accident. If it is the same to your lordship's grace, I would rather be hanged at once, and know what I'm about, than be given up to Sir Payan, to die no one can tell how." "Fear not, fool," said Wolsey, "but tell the whole truth, and you shall be safe, ay, and rewarded. Conceal anything, and you shall be hanged. Take him away, secretary, and examine him carefully. Make him give an exact account of everything he has seen in the house of Sir Payan Wileton, and after putting it in writing, swear him to it, and then, hark you," and he whispered something to the secretary, adding, "let him be there well used." The man was now removed from the cardinal's presence, and waiting till the messenger returned from Sir Payan's, Wolsey remained in deep thought, revolving in his keen and scrutinising mind all the parts of the shrewd plot he had just heard developed, and thinking over the best means of punishing Sir Payan Wileton in such a manner as to make his fall most bitter. While thus engaged, one of his secretaries entered, and bowing low, stood silent, as if waiting for permission to speak. "What is it?" said Wolsey. "Is it a matter of consequence?" The secretary bowed low again, and replied, "It is the herald's opinion, my lord, upon the succession of the old Lord Orham of Barnton, the miser, who left the 2 chests of gold, as well—" I know," said Wolsey. "How do they give it? I trust not to that base churl, William Orham, who struck my officer one day." "Oh, no, your grace," replied the secretary. "There are 2 nearer than he is, but they say the succession is quite clear. Charles Lord Orham, the great grandfather of the last, had 3 sons, from one of whom descends William Orham, but the eldest son, succeeding, had 2 sons and a daughter, all of whom married and had issue. The eldest son, Thomas Lord Orham, who died, leaving issue one only daughter, Miss Katrine Bulmer, by courtesy the Lady Katrine Bulmer, whom your grace may remember the queen took very young, when it was found that Lord Wilmington's estate went in male descent. She is the undoubted heiress." "Ha!" said Wolsey, "that changes much. Well, well, go see that it be clearly made out. Now, what says Sir Payan Wileton?" he continued, turning to the messenger, who had just returned. "The house is empty, so please your grace," replied the usher. "All but one old porter, who says that Sir Payan and his train set out for Chilham yesterday morning, after visiting your reverend lordship. He affirms, moreover, that the knight never got off his horse, but only gave orders that the priest should be sent down to Richmond with all speed, and then rode away himself for Kent." "So!" said the cardinal, his lip curling into a scornful sneer. "He finds his miscreant is caught, and thinks to deceive me with a tale that would not cloud the eyesight of an old woman. But let him stay. He shall lull himself into a fool's paradise, and then find himself fallen to nothing. That will do." The usher fell back, and for a moment Wolsey, as he was often wont, continued muttering to himself, "The Lady Katrine! She was Darby's full passion. If it lasts, he shall have her. 'Tis better than the other. Besides, the other girl is away, and he must have gold to bear out his charges at this meeting of Ardres. So shall it be. Well, well, send in whoever waits without," he added, speaking in a louder voice, and then applied himself to other business. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Darnley by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. 3 sides are sure embarred with crags and hills, the rest is easy, scarce to rise espied, but mighty bulwarks fence the plainer part. So art helps nature, nature strengthened art. Fairfax. Sir Knight, if knight thou be, abandon this forestalled place as erst, for fear of farther harm. Fairy Queen. It may well be supposed that under the circumstances in which we last left Sir Osborne, his feelings could not be of the most tranquil or gratifying nature, when, after having heard all that passed upon deck, he distinguished the steps of the officer sent to arrest him coming down the ladder. Longpole, for his part, looked very much as if he would have liked to display cold iron upon the occasion, but the knight made a sign to forbear, and in a moment after, a gentleman splendidly dressed, as one high in military command, entered the cabin, followed by 2 or 3 armed attendants. "Well, sir," said the knight, not very well distinguishing the stranger's features by the light in which he stood, "I suppose—" But he had not time to finish the sentence, for the officer grasped him heartily by the hand, exclaiming, "Now heaven bless us! Lord Darnley, my dear fellow in arms, how goes it with you these 2 years?" "Excellent well, good Sir Henry Talbot," replied the knight, frankly shaking the hand of his old companion. "But say, does your business lie with me?" "No, no, good faith," replied Sir Henry. "I came upon a very different errand. Since I was with Sir Thomas Peechy and yourself in Flanders, by my good Lord Surrey's favour I have obtained the command of one of the king's great ships, and as I lay last night off the mouth of the river, a pursuivant came down from London, with orders to stop every vessel that I saw, and search for a traitor who is endeavouring to make his escape to the continent." The knight's cheek burned, and for a moment he hesitated whether to avow himself at once, and repel the opprobrious epithet thus attached to the name he had assumed, and under which, he felt sure, he had never merited aught but honour. A moment's thought, however, showed him the madness of such a proceeding, and he replied, "I believe you will find no greater traitor here, Sir Henry, than myself." The officer smiled. "If that be the case," replied he, "I may as well row back to the ship. Perhaps he may be in the other vessel that lies to there, about a mile to windward. But come, Darnley, leave this filthy Dutch tub, come with me aboard, and after we have searched the other, I will land you in any part to which you are going, if it be between Middelburg and Boulogne." Although the knight did not feel himself bound, even by the most chivalrous principles of honour, to betray his own secret to Sir Henry Talbot, yet he did not consider himself at liberty to take advantage of his offer, and thus make one of the king's own ships the means of conveying him away from pursuit. He therefore replied, that as he was going to Dunkirk in some haste, and the Dutchman was steering straight thither, he thought it would be best to proceed without changing his ship, though he felt extremely obliged by the offer. The officer received his excuses in good part, and bidding him farewell, with many hearty wishes for his future prosperity, he mounted again to the dock, called his men together, abused the Dutchman vigorously for a few minutes, and getting into the boat, rowed away for his own vessel. It is hardly necessary here to inform the reader that the distinction which at present exists between the naval and military services has not been known above 150 years, and that consequently the fact of Sir Henry Talbot's having distinguished himself on land, so far from being a disqualification, was one of the highest recommendations to him in the sea service. Vonderbrugius takes no notice of the circumstance, as probably the same practice existed in his time, although the latest instance that I can call to mind is that of General Monk, who, after having lived on land all his life, grew amphibious at the age of 50. However that may be, deceiving himself as we have seen, Sir Henry Talbot left the young knight to meditate over the conduct of Wolsey, who would indeed have committed an egregious piece of folly in sending to arrest him by the name of Sir Osborne Maurice alone, if he had known him to be Lord Darnley, as Sir Osborne thought. Attributing it, however, to one of those accidental omissions which often disconcert the best arranged proceedings, the knight was congratulating himself on his good fortune, when Master Skippenhausen descended to offer his felicitations also, exclaiming, "My God, where did you hide yourself? Under that pile of hammocks, I'll warrant." "No, you man of salt herrings! No, you cousin German to a tub of butter!" exclaimed Longpole, whose indignation at the captain for having by his delay of the night before put them in such jeopardy, now broke forth irresistibly. "No, you dyke-begotten son of a swamp and a canal! If it had not been for you, we should never have run any risk; and don't flatter yourself that either you or your dirty hammocks either had any hand in saving us." "How did I make you run any risk, pray?" exclaimed the master. "You would have made me and my ship run a risk if you had been found in it; but I make you run none." "Stockfish, you lie!" cried the custrel. "Did you not lie in the mouth of the river all last night, when, if the blood in your veins had been anything but muddy Dutch puddle of the heaviest quality, you would have had us over to Dunkirk by this time? Deny it if you dare, Dutchman, and I will prove it upon your body, till I leave you no more shape than one of your own cheeses." The Dutchman bore the insolence of Longpole with all that calm magnanimity for which his nation is famed, says Vonderbrugius. However, Sir Osborne desired his attendant to be silent, and merely begging Master Skippenhausen to carry them to their destination as soon as possible, the matter ended. It was night before they arrived at Dunkirk, and without troubling the reader with all the details of their disembarkation, we shall merely beg him to look into the little hall of the Flemish inn, and see the knight and Longpole seated at the same table, according to the custom of the day, which we have before alluded to, while the host, standing behind the chair of Sir Osborne, answers the various questions which from time to time are addressed to him, and that black-eyed, smooth-faced, dingy serving-boy, who one might swear was a true son of Hans Holbein, filches away the half-finished tankard of raspis from Longpole's elbow, and supplies its place with an empty one. "And is Sir Albert of Koenigstein gone to Ratisbon too?" demanded Sir Osborne, pursuing the inquiries which he was engaged in making concerning his old comrades, amongst whom a sad dispersion had taken place during his absence. "Indeed, I cannot tell, sir knight," replied the landlord, "but very likely he is with the Count of Shoenvelt at Cassel." "What does Shoenvelt at Cassel?" asked the knight thoughtfully. "He is collecting adventurers, they say, sir, under a commission from the emperor," replied the host. "Some think to go against the Moors, but most people judge to protect the frontier against Robert de la Marck." "But Koenigstein would not serve under him," said Sir Osborne, meditating over what he heard. "He is a better captain 1,000 times, and a nobler spirit." "Well, sir," replied the landlord, "I tell you only what I heard. Somebody told me so, I am sure. Perhaps they command together. Boy, give his worship another tankard. Don't you see that one is out?" "Odds fish!" cried Longpole. "What, all gone? Your measures, mine host, are not like that certain knight's purse, that was no sooner empty than full again. It seems to me they are no sooner full than empty." "At Cassel, did you say he is?" demanded Sir Osborne. "Not exactly at Cassel, sir knight," replied the host, glad to pass away from the subject of the tankard; "but you know Mount St. Hubert, about a league from Cassel. Your worship will find him there." Sir Osborne made no reply, and after a while the host and his legion cleared the table of its encumbrances, and left the knight and his follower to pursue their own thoughts undisturbed. We can hardly wonder that, though now free from all danger of pursuit, the heart of the young knight was sad, and that his brow was clouded with many melancholy imaginings. It may be said, indeed, that he was not now worse in situation than when he was formerly in Flanders, and which time he had been happy and cheerful. But he was far worse, inasmuch as he had since entertained hopes and expectations which were now broken and passed away, inasmuch as he had known scenes and tasted joys that he had now lost, and which might never be his again. Every enjoyment of the human heart is like a tree planted deeply in the soil, which, when rooted out, leaves not the earth as it was before, but tears it up and scatters it abroad, and makes a yearning void, difficult to be filled again. However, there was one thing which he had gained, an object in life. Formerly his natural disposition, the chivalrous spirit of the age, the ardour of high health, and the strong impulsive bias given by early associations, had impelled him onward on the only path of renown then open to a daring spirit. But now he had a still more inspiring motive, a more individual incitement, to press forward to the goal of fame. Constance de Grey was ever present to his thoughts, furnished the spring of all his actions, and directed his every endeavour. Renown in arms was his already, but fortune, station, he felt he must gain at the sword's point, and he only sought a good cause wherein to draw it. The report that Albert of Koenigstein, his old friend and companion in arms, had joined the adventurers which the Count of Shoenvelt was collecting at Cassel, led him to imagine that the cause in which they would be engaged was one that he could himself embrace with honour, although Shoenvelt's name had not been hitherto very famous for the better qualities of chivalry. He doubted not, also, from the high station which he himself had filled in the armies of Burgundy, he should easily obtain that rank and command which he was entitled to expect amongst the troops thus assembled. The history of the various bands of adventurers of that day offers us some of the most curious and interesting particulars of a curious and interesting age. These companies, totally distinct from the regular armies of the time, if regular armies they might be called, were generally levied by some enterprising feudal lord, and commencing most frequently amongst his own vassals, afterwards swelled out into the very formidable bodies by a junction with other bands, and by the continual accession of brave and veteran soldiers, cast upon the world by the sovereigns they had served, when peace rendered their swords no longer necessary. Of course, the numbers in these companies varied very much according to circumstances, as well as their regulations and deportment. Sometimes they consisted of thousands, sometimes of simple tens. Sometimes, with the strictest discipline and the most unshrinking valour, they entered into the service of kings, and decided the fate of empires. Sometimes they were little better than roving bands of robbers, that lived by rapine and hardly acknowledged law. Most frequently, however, in the age of which we treat, they volunteered their support to the armies of their own sovereign or his own allies, and often proved more active than the body they came to aid. However, if Theseus had played at pitch and toss with Ariadne's clue, he would never have slain the Minotaur, and, therefore, we must go on with the thread of our own story, notwithstanding a strong inclination to pause and sport with the subject of the adventurers. Nevertheless, thus much we will say: if our readers wish a treat, let them read the delightful old Memoir de Fleurange, l'Aventurier, as he calls himself, which, for simplicity, and I may use the term, bonhomie of style, for curious incident and romantic adventure, is far superior to any romance that ever was written. Many curious particulars also, concerning the appearance and conduct of the adventurers, may be found in the letters of Clément Marot to Marguerite de Valois. But to proceed. The next morning, by daybreak, Sir Osborne and his companion were once more on horseback, and on their way to Mount Castle, the knight having determined to learn in the first place the views of Shoenvelt, and to examine the real state of his troops, before he offered himself as a companion in the adventure. In case he found their object such as he could not himself seek, his mind was hardly made up whether to offer his services to the Emperor or to Francis, King of France. His old habits, indeed, tended to make him prefer the imperial army, but from all he had heard of the new chief of the German Confederacy, there was a sort of cold-blooded, calculating policy in his every action, that little accorded with the warm and chivalrous feelings of the young knight; while, at the same time, there was in the whole conduct of Francis a noble, candid generosity of heart, a wild, enthusiastic spirit of daring and adventure, that wonderfully attracted Sir Osborne towards him. Journeying on with a quick pace, Mount Castle soon rose to the traveller's sight, starting out of the vast plains in which it stands, like some high spirit towering above the flat multitude. Sweeping round its base, the knight turned his horse towards a lesser hill, at about 2 miles' distance, the top of which was in that day crowned by the castle of Shoenvelt. From the plain below, as the eye wandered up the side of the mountain, amidst the wood and broom that covered the rock in large masses, might be seen peeping forth wall, and bastion, and outwork, while higher up, in zigzag lines upon the clear background of the sky, appeared the towers and battlements of the castle, with the tall donjon rising above them all, and the banner of Shoenvelt, bearing sable as sautier gules, floating in the sunshine. A broad, fair road offered itself for the travellers' horses, winding along a narrow rocky ridge, which was the only part that, slowly descending, joined the hill gradually to the plain. All the rest was steep and precipitous, and too well guarded by nature to be liable to attack; while overhanging this sole approach might be seen on every side many a frowning defence, well prepared against any hostile footstep. Gradually, as the road wound upwards, it grew narrower and more narrow, confined between 2 high banks, commanded by the towers of the castle, while the road itself was completely raked by the guns of the barbican. Sir Osborne remarked it all with a soldier's eye, looking on it as a mechanic does on some fine piece of art, and observing the purpose of every different part. Pressing on, however, he soon arrived at the gate, and demanded if Sir Albert of Koenigstein was in the castle. Though it was a time of peace, no gate was opened, and the sole response of the soldier to whom he spoke was, "Who are you?" uttered through the grille of the barbican. The knight gave his name, and the man retired without making any further answer. "This looks like precaution, Longpole," said the knight. "Methinks they would run no great danger in letting 2 men pass the gate, though they may be armed at all points." "I suppose the custom of this castle is like the custom of a rat hole," replied Longpole, "to let but one in at a time. But I hope you won't stay here, my lord. I have an invincible hatred at being built up. As much of the camp and fair field as you like, but Lord deliver me from stone and mortar. Besides, this place smacks marvellously of a den of free companions. Look at that fellow with the pike on his shoulder. Neither his morion nor his corslet has known sand and the rubbing stick since his great ancestor was drowned with Pharaoh, and 'twas then his harness got so rusty, depend on it." "In a Red Sea, I am afraid," said Sir Osborne. "But here comes the janitor." As he spoke, the guardian of the gate approached with a bunch of keys, and soon gave the knight the means of entrance. Sir Osborne, however, still held his bridle in, and demanded once more if Sir Albert of Koenigstein was in the castle. "I cannot tell you, sir," replied the soldier. "I know not the titles of all the knights here. All I can say is, that I gave your name and errand to my lord, who sits at table in the great hall, and that he greets you heartily, and invites you in." At this moment a group of gentlemen appeared, coming through the gate of the inner ballium, and Sir Osborne, not doubting that they had been sent by the count to conduct him to the hall, saw that he could not now avoid entering, whether the officer he sought was there or not. Riding through the gate then, he dismounted, and giving his horse to Longpole, met the party he had seen advancing, the principal of whom, with much reverence and courtesy, prayed the Sire de Darnley, on the part of Count Shoenvelt, to enter and quaff a cup of wine with him. Sir Osborne expressed his willingness to do so in the same strain, and then repeated his inquiry for his friend. "We are unhappy in not having his company," replied the gentleman, "but I believe the count expects him here in a few days." He was a young man who spoke, and there was a sort of flush came over his cheek as he announced the probable coming of Konigstein, which induced Sir Osborne to imagine that his report was not very correct; and fixing his eye upon him, he merely said, "Does he?" with a slight degree of emphasis. "Yes, sir, he does," said the youth, colouring still more highly. "Do you mean to say he does not?" "Not in the least," said Sir Osborne, "as you may see by my seeking him here, and I am sure that so gallant a squire as yourself would never swerve from truth." The young man bent down his eyes and began playing with his sword knot, while Sir Osborne, now perfectly convinced that the whole tale was a falsehood, followed on in silence, prepared to act according to this opinion. In a few minutes they passed through the portal of the keep, and entered at once into the great hall, up the midst of which was placed a long table, surrounded by the chief of Shoenvelt's adventurers, with various pages and varlets, serving the meats and pouring out the wine. Round upon the walls hung the arms of the various guests, cumbering every hook or peg that could be found, and where these had been scanty, they were cast upon the ground behind the owners' seats, together with saddles and bards and other horse caparisons, while in the corner leaned several scores of lances, mingled amongst which were one or two knightly pennons, and many a sheaf of arrows, jostled by the upstart weapons destined in the end to banish them from the stage, such as hackbutts, handguns, and other newly invented firearms. At the farther end of the table, digging deeply with his dagger in a chine of wild boar pork, which had been just placed before him, sat the Count of Shoenvelt himself, tall, strong-limbed, and grisly, with a long, drooping, hooked nose, depressed at the point, as if some one had set his thumb on it, at the same time squeezing it down, and rather twisting it on one side. This feature was flanked, if one may use the term, by a pair of small, keen hawk's eyes, which expressed more active cunning than vigorous thought, while a couple of immense ears, sticking out on each side of his head, and worn into various irregular callosities by the pressure of his helmet, gave a singular and brute-like appearance to his whole visage, not easy to be described. He was dressed in a hacqueton, or close jacket of buff leather, laced with gold, on which might be seen, especially towards the arms, sundry daubs and stains, to the number of which he had just added another, by dashing all the gravy over his sleeve in his furious hacking of the large and stubborn piece of meat before him. This accident had called into the face not the most angelic expression, and as he sat, he would have made a good picture of an inferior sort of devil, the whole effect being heightened by a strong ray of light passing through a purple pane of the stained glass window, and falling in a ghastly lustre upon his dark, ferocious countenance. The moment, however, that he perceived Sir Osborne, his brow was smoothed, and rising from his seat, he advanced towards him with great expression of joy. "My dear Lord of Darnley," cried he, taking him in his arms, and pressing him to his bosom with a hug that the knight would willingly have dispensed with, "welcome, 1,000 times welcome to Sir Hubert's castle. Whether you come to stay with us as a companion, or whether you are but a passing guest, your visit is an honour and a delight to all within these walls. Knights and gentlemen," continued he, "pledge me all a cup to the health of the Sire de Darnley." To the party by whom he was surrounded, such a proposal was what nobody felt at all inclined to reject, and consequently there was instantly a loud rattling of cups and tankards, and no one complained that his bowl was too full. All pledged Lord Darnley, and he could not refuse to do them justice in a cup of wine. After which, taking the seat that Shoenvelt assigned him by his side, the knight gazed over the various grim and war-worn faces which were gathered round the table, some of which he knew merely by sight, and some who, having exchanged a word or two with him in the various reciprocations of military service, now looked as if they claimed some mark of recognition. Sir Osborne was not the man to reject such appeal, and he gave the expected bow to each, although amongst them all he saw no one who had greatly distinguished himself for those high feelings and generous virtues that ever marked the true knight. Many were the questions that were asked him, many the conjectures that were propounded to him for confirmation, respecting the designs of France and England, and of Germany, and it was some time before he could cut them short, by informing his interrogators that he had been for the last 3 months in his own country, so deeply occupied by his private affairs that he had given no attention to the passing politics of the day. The whole party seemed greatly disappointed, entertaining apparently a much more violent thirst for news than even that which is commonly to be met with in all small communities, cut off from general information, and unoccupied by greater or better subjects of contemplation. As soon as the meal, which was drawing towards its end when Sir Osborne entered, was completely concluded, Shoenvelt rose and begged to entertain him for a few minutes in private, which being agreed to, he led him forth to a small space enclosed with walls, wherein the provident châtelain had contrived to lay up, against the hour of need, a very sufficient store of cabbages, turnips, carrots, and other canaille of the vegetable kingdom, which may be very serviceable in case of siege. Here, walking up and down a long path that bordered the beds, with Sir Osborne on his right, and a knight named Wilston, whom he had invited to the conference, on his left, Shoenvelt addressed Lord Darnley somewhat to the following effect, generally, while he did so, fixing his eyes upon vacancy, as a man does who recites awkwardly a set speech, but still from time to time giving a quick, sharp glance towards the knight's countenance, to see the impression he produced. "Valiant and worthy knight," said Shoenvelt, "every one, whether in Germany or France, England or Spain, or even here in our own poor duchy of Burgundy, every one, I say, has heard of your valorous feats and courageous deeds of arms, wherefore it cannot be matter of astonishment to you that wherever there is a captain who, having gathered together a few hardy troops, is desirous of signalizing himself in the service of his country, wherever there is such a one, I say, you cannot be surprised that he wishes to gain you to his aid." Here Shoenvelt gave a glance at Wilston, to see if he approved his proem, after which he again proceeded. "Now you must know, worthy knight, that I have here in my poor castle, which is a strong one, as you may perceive, no less than 500 as good spearmen as ever crossed a horse, which I have gathered together for no mean purpose. A purpose," he continued mysteriously, "which, if effected, will not only enrich all persons who contribute their aid thereto, but will gain them the eternal thanks of our good and noble emperor. I could say no more. "Tonder, man, tell him," cried Wilston, who had served with Sir Osborne, and had the reputation of being a brave and gallant knight, though somewhat addicted to plunder. "Or let me tell him, for your bedevilled hems take more time than it would to storm a fort. This is the case, sir knight. A great meeting is to take place between the King of France and the King of England at the border, and all the nobility of France are in motion through Picardy and the frontier provinces, covered with more gold than they ever had in their lives before. Even Francis himself, like a mad fool, is running from castle to castle along the frontier, sometimes with not more than half a dozen followers. Now then, fancy what a rich picking may be had amidst these gay French gallants, and if Francis himself were to fall into our hands, we might command half a kingdom for his ransom." "But I thought that the two countries were at peace," said the knight, with a coldness of manner sufficiently marked, and, as he thought, to prevent any further communication of the kind. Wilston, however, was not to be stopped, and replied, "Ay, a sort of peace, a peace that is no peace on the frontiers. Don't let that frighten you. We can prove that they were the first aggressors. Why did not they, less than 10 days ago, attack the garrison of St. Omer, and kill 3 men in trying to force the gate? Have they not ravaged half Hainault? But, however, as I said, be not startled at that. Shoenvelt saw the emperor about 2 months ago, who gave him to understand that we could not do him a better service than either to take Francis alive or give him a stroke with a lance. And fear not that our plans are well laid. We have already 200 men scattered over the frontier. Every forest, every village has its 10 or 12 ready to join at a moment's notice, when we sound to the standard. 200 more follow tonight, and Shoenvelt and I tomorrow, in small parties, so as not to be suspected. Already we have taken a rich burgher of Beauvais, with velvets and cloths of gold worth 100,000 florins. But that is nothing. The king is our great object, and him we shall have, unless some cursed accident prevents it. For we do not hunt him by report only. We have our gaze-hound upon him, who never loses sight. What think you of that, Sir Knight? Count William of Furstenberg, Shoenvelt's cousin, who is constantly with Francis, ay, and well beloved of him, is our sworn companion, and gives us notice of all his doings. What think you of that, Sir Knight, huh?" "I think him a most infernal villain," cried Sir Osborne, his indignation breaking forth in spite of his better judgment. "By heaven, before I would colleague with such a traitor, I'd have my hand struck off." "Ha!" cried Shoenvelt, who had marked the knight's coldness all along, and now burst into fury. "A traitor! Sir Knight, you lie. Ho! Shut the gates there. By heaven, he will betray us, Wilston. Call Macquart's guard. Down with him to a dungeon." And laying his hand upon his sword, he prepared to stop the knight, who now strode rapidly towards the gate. "Nay, nay," cried Wilston, holding his companion's arm. "Remember, Shoenvelt, 'tis your own hold. He must not be hurt here. Nay, by my faith, he shall not. You will find a more fitting place. Hold, I say." While Shoenvelt, still furious, strove to free himself from Wilston, Sir Osborne passed the gate of the garden and entered the space of the outer ballium, where Longpole had pertinaciously remained with the 2 horses, as close to the barbican, the gate of which had been left open when they entered, as possible, seeming to have had a sort of presentiment that it might be necessary to secure possession of the bridge. The moment the knight appeared without any conductors, the shrewd custrel conceived at once that something had gone wrong, sprang upon his own horse, gave a glance round the court to see if his retreat could not be cut off, and perceiving that almost all the soldiers were near the inner wall, he led forward his lord's charger to meet him. Sir Osborne had his foot in the stirrup when Shoenvelt, now broken away from Wilston, rushed forth from the garden, vociferating to his men to shut the gate and to raise the drawbridge. But in a moment the knight was in the saddle, and spurring on, with one buffet of his hand in passing, he felled a soldier who had started forward to drop the portcullis, and darted over the bridge. "On to the other gate, Longpole," cried he. "Quick, make sure of it." And turning his own horse, he faced Shoenvelt, who now, seeing him gone beyond his power, stood foaming under the arch. "Count of Shoenvelt," cried he, drawing off his glove, "thou art a liar, a traitor, and a villain, which, when you will, I will prove upon your body. There lies my gage." And casting down his gauntlet, he galloped after Longpole, who stood with his sword drawn in a small outer gate, which had been thrown forward even beyond the barbican. "Up, archers, up!" cried Shoenvelt, storming with passion. "Up, lazy villains! 100 crowns to him who sends me an arrow through his heart. Draw, draw, slaves! Draw, I say!" In a moment an arrow stuck in Sir Osborne's surcoat, and another lighted on his casquet. But luckily, as we have seen, the more easily to carry his harness or armour, he rode completely armed, and the missiles from the castle fell in vain. However, lest his horse should suffer, which, not being sufficiently covered by its bard to insure it from a chance arrow, might have been disabled at the very moment he needed it most, the knight spurred on as fast as possible, and having joined Longpole, descended the narrow way by which they had mounted. Still for some way the arrows continued to fall about them, though with less assured aim and exhausted force, so that the only danger that remained might be apprehended either from the guns of the castle being fired upon them, or from Shoenvelt's sending out a body of spearmen in their pursuit. Neither of these, however, took place, the inhabitants of the country round, and the commander of Cassel, being too jealous and suspicious of Shoenvelt already for him to do anything which might more particularly attract their attention. And to this cause, and this cause only, was Sir Osborne indebted for his unpursued escape. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Darnley by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32. How blessed am I by such a man led, under whose wise and careful guardship I now despise fatigue and hardship. As soon as they were out of reach of immediate annoyance, the knight reined in his horse and turned to see if Shoenvelt showed any symptoms of an inclination to follow. But all was now quiet. The gates were shut, the drawbridge was raised, and not even an archer to be seen upon the walls. Sir Osborne's eye, however, ran over tower, and bartizan, and wall, and battlement, with so keen and searching a glance, that if any watched him in his progress, it must have been from the darkest loophole in the castle, to escape the notice of his eye. Satisfied at length with his scrutiny, he again pursued his journey down the steep descent into the vast plains of Flanders, and turned his horse towards Mount Cassel, giving Longpole an account, as he went, of the honourable plans and purposes of the good Count of Shoenvelt. "Odds life, my lord," said Longpole, "let us go into that part of the world too. If we could but get a good stout fellow or two to our back, we might disconcert them." "I fear they are too many for us," replied the knight, "though it seems that Shoenvelt, avaricious of all he can get, and afraid that aught should slip through his hands, has divided his men into 10s and 12s, so that a few spears well led might do a great deal of harm amongst them. At all events, Longpole, we will buy a couple of lances at Cassel, for we may yet chance to meet with some of Shoenvelt's followers on our road." Conversing of their future proceedings, they now mounted the steep ascent of Mount Cassel, and approached the gate of the town, the iron grate of which, to their surprise, was slowly pushed back in their faces as they rode up. "Ho, soldier! Why do you shut the gate?" cried Sir Osborne. "Don't you see we are coming in?" "No, you are not," replied the other, who was a stiff old Hainaulter, looking as rigid and intractable as the iron jack that covered his shoulders. "None of Shoenvelt's plunderers come in here." "But we are neither friends nor plunderers of Shoenvelt's," said the knight. "We are his enemies, and have just made our escape from St. Hubert's." "Ah, a fine tale, a fine tale!" replied the soldier, through the barred gate, which he continued slowly and imperturbably to fasten against them. "We saw you come down the hill, but you don't step in here to night, so you had better ride away before the captain sends down to make you. We all know that you can lie as well as rob." "By my life, if I were in, I'd split your morion for you," said the knight, enraged at the cool nonchalance of the Hainaulter. "Doubtless," replied he, in the same sort of indifferent snuffling tone, "doubtless, you look like it, and that's one reason why I shall keep you out." Sir Osborne wasted no more words on the immovable old pikeman, but angrily turning his horse, began to descend the hill. A little way down the steep, there was even then, as now, a small hamlet serving as a sort of suburb to the town above, and towards this the knight took his way, pausing to gaze, every now and then, on the vast interminable plain that lay stretched at his feet. spread over which he could see 1,000 cities and villages, all filled with their own little interests and feelings, wherein he had no part nor sympathy, and 1,000 roads leading away to them, in every direction, without any one to guide his choice, or to tell him on which he might expect prosperity or disaster. "To Air," said he, after he had thought for some time. "We will go to Air. I hear that the Count de Ligny, whom I fought at Isson, is there, and the Chevalier Bayard, and many other gallant knights and gentlemen, who, perhaps, may welcome me amongst them. Is not that the smoke of a forge, Longpole? Perhaps we may find an armourer. Let us see." As the knight had imagined, so it proved, and on their demanding 2 strong lances, the armourer soon brought them forward a bundle of stiff ash staves, bidding them choose. After some examination to ascertain the soundness of the wood, their choice was made, and the Fleming proceeded to adjust to the smaller end of each 2 handsbreadths of pointed iron, which being fastened and clenched, the knight and his follower paid the charge, and taking possession of their new weapons, rode away, directing their course towards Hazebrook, in their way to Aire. Their progress now became necessarily slow, for though both horses were powerful in limb and joint, and trained to carry great burdens and endure much fatigue, yet the weight of a heavy iron bard, together with that of a tall, strong man, armed at all points, was such that in a long journey it of course made itself felt. Evidently perceiving by the languor of his motions that the charger which bore him was becoming greatly wearied, Sir Osborne ceased to urge him, and proposed to stop for the evening at the very first village that could boast of an inn. Nevertheless, it was some time before they met with such a one, most of the hamlets on the road being too poor and insignificant to require or possess anything of the kind. At length, however, a small, neat house, with a verdant holly bush over the door, invited their steps, and entering, Sir Osborne was saluted heartily by the civil host, who, with brandished knife and snowy bib, was busily engaged in cooking various savoury messes for any guest that Providence might send him. Some specimens of his handiwork were placed before the knight and Longpole, as soon as their horses had been taken care of, and an excellent bottle of old wine, together with some fatigue, induced them to linger a little at the table. The lattice, which was open, looked out across the road to the little village green, where was to be seen many a schoolboy playing in the fine May evening, and mocking, in his childish sports, the sadder doings of the grown-up children of the day. Here, horsed upon their fellows' backs, were 2 that acted the part of knights, tilting each other with broomsticks, and there, marshalled in fair order by a youthful captain, marched a body of young lansquenets, advancing and retreating, wheeling and charging, with no small precision. Sir Osborne watched them for a while in somewhat of a moralizing mood, till his musing was disturbed by the trotting of a horse past the window, and in a moment after he heard the good-humoured voice of the host addressing the person who arrived. "Ah, Master Frederick," he said, "what, back again so soon? I told you you would soon be tired of soldiering." "Nay, nay, Reginald," answered a voice that Sir Osborne thought he had heard before. "I am not tired of soldiering, and never shall be, but I am tired of consorting with a horde of plunderers, for such are Shoenvelt and all his followers. But while I lead my horse to the stable, get me something to eat, good Reginald, for I do not want to go back to the hall till I have dented my sword at least." "What, are you going to it again?" cried the host. "Stay at home, Master Frederick, stay at home. Take care of the house your father has left you. If you are not so rich as the baron, you have enough, and that is better than riches if one knew it." "My father was a soldier," answered the young man, "and distinguished himself, and so will I, before I sit down in peace." Here the conversation ceased, and the host, entering the room in which sat the knight and his follower, began to lay out one of the small tables with which it was furnished. "That is as good a youth," said he, addressing Sir Osborne, while he proceeded with his preparations, "that is as good a youth as ever breathed, if he had not taken this fit of soldiering. His father was a younger brother of old Count Ulterman, and after many years' service came to our village, and bought a piece of ground, where he built a house. Your worship may see it from here, over the side of the hill, with the wood behind it. He has been dead now a year, and his wife near 3, and so Master Frederick there must needs go soldiering. They say it is all love for the baron's daughter. But here he comes." As he spoke, the young man entered the room, presenting to Sir Osborne, as he had expected, the face of the youth who had been sent by Shoenvelt to welcome him on his arrival at the castle. An ingenuous blush overspread the young Hainaulter's countenance when he saw Sir Osborne, and taking his seat at the table prepared for him, he turned away his head and began his meal in silence. "Had you not better take off your corslet, Master Frederick?" demanded the host. "No, no, Reginald," replied the youth. "I do not know that I shall stay here all night. Never mind, give me some wine and leave me." Thus repulsed, the innkeeper withdrew, and Sir Osborne continued to watch the young soldier, who, whether it was a feeling of shame at meeting the knight, and degradation at having been made, even in a degree, a party to Shoenvelt's attempt to deceive him, or whether it was bitterness of spirit at returning to his native place unsuccessful, seemed to have his heart quite full, and it appeared to be with pain that he ate the food which was placed before him. Sir Osborne could feel for disappointed hopes, and after regarding him for a moment or two in silence, he crossed the room and laid his hand upon his shoulder. The young man turned round with a flushed cheek, hardly knowing whether from anger at the familiarity to vent the feelings of his heart, or to take it in good part, and strive to win the esteem of a man whom he had been taught to admire. But there was a frankness in the knight's manner, and a noble kindness of intent in his look, that soon removed all doubt. "So, young gentleman," said he, "you have left Count Shoenvelt's company. I thought you were not made to stay long amongst them. But say, was it with his will?" "I stayed not to ask, my lord," replied the young man. "I was bound to Shoenvelt in no way, and the moment the gates were opened after you were gone, I rode out and came away." Sir Osborne shook his head. "When a soldier engages with a commander," said he, "his own will and pleasure must not be the terms of his service. But of all things, he ought not to quit his leader's banner without giving notice that he intends to do so." "But, thank God," cried the young Hainaulter, "I had not yet taken service with Shoenvelt. He wanted to swear me to it, as he does the rest, but I would not do so till I saw more of him and of his plans, and so I told him." "That makes the matter very different," replied the knight with a smile. "I am heartily glad to hear it, for I dare pronounce him a traitorous ruffian, and no true knight. But one more question, young sir, if I urged not your patience. How came you to seek Shoenvelt at first, who never bore a high renown but as a marauder?" The youth hesitated. "It matters not, sir knight," replied he, after a moment's pause, "to you or to any one, what reasons I might have to seek renown as speedily as possible, and why the long tedious road to knighthood and to fame, first as page, and then as squire, and then as man at arms, was such as I could not bear. But so it was; and as Shoenvelt gave out that he had high commissions from the emperor, and was to do great deeds, I hoped that with him I might find speedy means of signalizing myself. After being 2 days at the castle, I discovered that his whole design was plunder, which was not the way to fame; and this morning he made me deliver you a message, which I knew to be a falsehood, which was not the road to honour. So I determined to leave him; and as the spearmen are always dropping out of the castle by 5 or 6 at a time, to go down to the frontier, I soon found the means of getting away." "Yours is an error, my good youth," said Sir Osborne, "which I am afraid we are all wont to entertain in the first heat of our early days. But we soon find that the road to fame is hard and difficult of access, and that it requires time and perseverance, and labour and strength, even to make a small progress therein. Those who, with a gay imagination, fancy they have made themselves wings to fly up to the top soon, like the Cretan of old, sear their pinions in the sun, and drop into the sea of oblivion. However, are you willing to follow a poor knight who, though he cannot promise either fame or riches, will lead you at least in the path of honour?" The enthusiastic youth caught the knight's hand, and kissed it with inexpressible delight. "What, follow you?" cried he. "Follow the Lord Darnley, the Knight of Burgundy, whose single arm maintained the bridge at Beauvais against the bravest of the Duke of Alençon's horse? Ay, that I will. Follow him through the world. Do you hear that, Reginald?" he cried to the innkeeper, who now entered. "Do you hear that? Instead of the base Shoenvelt, I am going to follow the noble Lord of Darnley, who was armed a knight by the Emperor himself." The honest innkeeper congratulated Master Frederick heartily upon the exchange, for the knight was now in that part of the country where his name, if not his person, was well known; and in that age the fame of gallant actions and of noble bearing spread rapidly through all ranks, and gained the meed of applause from men whom we might suppose little capable of appreciating it. All preliminaries were speedily arranged, and the next morning Sir Osborne set out by dawn for the small town of Hazebrook, which lay at about 2 leagues' distance, where he took care to furnish his new follower with a lance and several pieces of defensive armour that were wanting to his equipment; and then, to ascertain what reliance might be placed on his support in case of emergency, he excited him to practise various military exercises with himself as they rode along towards Ayr. To his no small surprise and pleasure, he found that the young Hainaulter, though somewhat rash and hasty, was far more skilful in the use of his weapons and the management of his horse than he could have conceived; and with such an addition to his party, he no longer scrupled to cast himself in the way of some of Shoenvelt's bodies of marauders, to keep his hand in, as Longpole quaintly expressed it, when he heard his lord's determination. "Come, Frederick," said the knight, "I will not go on to Ayr, as I had determined, but, in order to gratify your wish for renown, we will lie about on the frontier, like true errant knights of old, at any village or other place where we may find shelter; and if we meet with Shoenvelt, or any of his, mind you do honour to your arms. We shall always have the odds of 8 or 9 against us." "No, no, sir knight," cried the young soldier, "do not believe that. It is one of his falsehoods. There are not above 10 in any of the bands, and most of them are 5 or 6. I know where most of them lie." "Hush, hush!" cried Sir Osborne, raising his finger. "You must tell me nothing, so that, if you should chance to break a lance with him, your hand may not tremble at thinking you have betrayed his counsel. Nay, do not blush, Frederick. A man who aspires to chivalry must guide himself by stricter rules than other men. It was for this I spoke. Here is the fair river Lys, if I remember right." "It is so, sir knight," replied the other. "There is a bridge about a mile lower down." "What, for a brook like this?" cried Sir Osborne, spurring his horse in. "Oh, no, we will swim it. Follow." The young Hainaulter's horse did not like the plunge, and shied away from the brink. "Spur him in, spur him in!" cried Longpole. "If our lord reaches the other bank first, he will never forgive us. He swims like an otter himself, and fancies that his squires ought to be water rats by birthright." "Down with the left rein!" cried the knight, turning as his horse swam, and seeing the situation of his young follower. "Give him the spur, bring him to a demi-volte, and he must in." As the knight said, at the second movement of the demi-volte, the horse's feet were brought to the very brink of the river, and a slight touch of the mullet made him plunge over, so that, though somewhat embarrassed with his lance in the water, Frederick soon reached the other bank in safety. One of the beautiful Flemish meadows which still in many parts skirt the bank of the Lys presented itself on the other side, and, beyond that, a forest that has long since known the rude touch of the heavy axe, which, like some fell enchanter's wand, has made so many of the loveliest woods in Europe disappear, without leaving a trace behind. The one we speak of was then in its full glory, sweeping along with a rich undulating outline by the side of the soft green plain that bordered the river, sometimes advancing close to the very brink, as if the giant trees of which it was comprised ought to contemplate their grandeur in the watery mirror, sometimes falling far away and leaving a wide open space between itself and the stream, covered with thick short grass, and strewed with the thousand flowers wherewith nature's liberal hand has fondly decorated her favourite spring. Every here and there, too, the wood itself would break away, discovering a long glade penetrating into the deepest recesses of its bosom, filled with the rich, mellow forest light that, streaming between every aperture, checkered the green, mossy path below, and showed a long perspective of vivid light and shade as far as the eye could reach. It was up one of these that Sir Osborne took his way, willing to try the mettle of his new follower, and to initiate him into the trade war by a few of its first hardships and dangers. Doubting not that Shoenvelt had taken advantage of that forest, situated as it was between Lille and Ayr, to post at least one party of his men therein. From what the youth had let drop, as well as from what he had himself observed, the knight was led to believe that the adventurer had greatly magnified the number of his forces, and he also concluded that, to avoid suspicion, he had divided his men into very small troops, except on such points as he expected the King of France himself to pass, and even there Sir Osborne did not doubt that 30 men would be the extent of any one body, Francis's habit of riding almost unattended, with the fearless confidence natural to his character, being but too well known on the frontier. To meet with Shoenvelt himself, and, if possible, to disappoint his schemes of plunder, was now the knight's castle in the air; and though the numbers of his own party were so scanty, he felt the sort of confident assurance in his own courage, his own strength, and his own skill, which is ever worth a host of moments in danger. Longpole, he was also sure, would be no inefficient aid; and though the young Hainaulter might not be their equal in experience or skill, Sir Osborne did not fear that, in time of need, his enthusiastic courage and desire to distinguish himself would make him more than a match for one of Shoenvelt's company. Under these circumstances, the knight would never have hesitated to attack a body of double, or perhaps treble, his own number; and yet he resolved to proceed cautiously, endeavouring in the first place to inform himself of the situation of Shoenvelt's various bands, and to ascertain which that marauder was likely to join himself. Wilsten having let drop that he and the count, as the two leaders of their whole force, were to set out the next morning, Sir Osborne saw that no time was to be lost in reconnoitring the ground, in order to ascertain the real strength of the adventurers. He resolved, therefore, to take every means to learn their numbers, and if he found the amount more formidable than he imagined, to risk nothing with so few, but to provide for the king's safety by giving notice to the garrison of Ayr that the monarch was menaced by danger, and then to aid with his own hand in ridding the frontier of such dangerous visitors, though he felt a great degree of reluctance to share with any one an enterprise full of honourable danger. It was likewise necessary to ascertain where Francis I. was, for Shoenvelt might have been deceived, or the king might have already quitted the frontier, or he might be accompanied by a sufficient escort to place his person in security; or, in short, 1,000 circumstances might have happened which would render the enterprise of the adventurers abortive, and his own interference unnecessary, if not impertinent. Revolving all these considerations in his mind, sometimes proceeding in silence, sometimes calling upon his companions for their opinion, Sir Osborne took his way up one of the deep glades of the forest, still keeping a watchful ear to every sound that stirred in the wood, so that not a note of the thrush or the blackbird, nor the screaming of a jay, nor the rustle of a rabbit, escaped him; and yet nothing met his ear which might denote that there were other beings hid beneath those green boughs besides themselves and the savage tenants of the place, the stag, the wild boar, and the wolf. The deep ruts formed by heavy wood carts in the soft mossy carpet of the glade told that the route they were pursuing was one which most probably communicated with some village, or some other road of greater thoroughfare, and after following it for about a mile, they perceived that, now joined to another exactly similar to itself, it wound away to the left, leaving nothing but a small bridle way before them, which Sir Osborne judged must lead to some spot where the wood had been cleared. As their horses were now rather fatigued, and the full sun shining upon the forest rendered its airless paths very oppressive, the knight chose the little path before him, hoping it would lead to a more open space where they might repose for a while, and at the same time keep a watch upon the roads they had just quitted. His expectations were not deceitful, for after having proceeded about 200 yards, they came to a little grassy mound in the wood, which in former times might have monumented the field of some Gallic or Roman victory, piled up above the bones of the mighty dead. Even now, though the forest had grown around and girt it in on every side, the trees themselves seemed to hold it in reverence, leaving it, and even some space around it, free from their grasping roots, except, indeed, where a group of idle hawthorns had gathered impudently on its very summit, flaunting their light blossoms in the sun, and spreading their perfume on the wind. It was the very spot suited to Sir Osborne's purpose, and, dismounting, the three travellers leaned their lances against the trees, and letting their horses pick a meal from the forest grass, prepared to repose themselves under the shadow of the thorns. Previous to casting himself down upon the bank, however, the knight took care to examine the wood around them, and seeing a sort of yellow light shining between the trees beyond, he pursued his way along what seemed a continuation of the little path which had brought them thither. Proceeding in a slanting direction, apparently to avoid the bolls of some enormous beeches, it did not lead on for above 10 or 12 yards, and then opened out into a high road cut through the very wildest part of the forest, at a spot where an old stone cross and fountain of clear water commemorated the philanthropy of someone long dead, and offered the best of nature's gifts to the lip of the weary traveller. Sir Osborne profited by the occasion, and communicated his discovery to his companions, who took advantage of it to satisfy their thirst also. Then they lay down in the shade of the hawthorns on the mound, and after some brief conversation, the heat of the day so overpowered the young Hainaulter that he fell asleep. Such an example was never lost upon Longpole, who soon resigned himself to the drowsy god, and Sir Osborne was left the only watcher of the party. Whether from his greater bodily powers, on which fatigue made but little impression, or from deeper feelings and thoughts that would not rest, sleep came not near his eyelids, and lying at his ease in the fragrant air, 1,000 busy memories came thronging through his brain, recalling love and hope and joy, and teaching to believe that all might yet be his. While thus indulging waking visions, he thought he heard a distant horn, and listening, the same sound was again borne upon the wind from some part of the forest. It was, however, no warlike note, but evidently proceeded from the horn of some huntsman, who, as Sir Osborne concluded from the time of the year, was chasing the wolf, to whom no season gives repose. Falling back into the position from which he had risen to listen, Sir Osborne had again given himself up to thought, when he was once more roused by the sound of voices and the trampling of horses' feet on the road hard by. Rising silently, without disturbing his companions, he glided part of the way down the path leading to the fountain, and paused amid some oaks and shrubs, through the leaves of which he could observe what passed on the highway without being seen himself. Nearly opposite to the cross already mentioned appeared 2 horsemen, one of whom allowed his beast to drink where the water, gurgling over the basin of the fountain, formed a little streamlet across the road, while the other held in his rein about a pace behind, as if waiting with some degree of respect for his companion. As soon as the horse raised its head, the first cavalier turned round, and presented to Sir Osborne's view a fine and princely countenance, whose every feature, whose every glance, bespoke a generous and noble spirit. In complexion, the stranger was of a deep tanned brown, with his eyes, his hair, and his mustachio nearly black. His brow was broad and clear, his eyes were large and full, though shaded by the dark eyelashes that overhung them. His nose was straight, and perhaps somewhat too long, while his mouth was small, and would have been almost too delicate had it not been for a certain marked curl of the upper lip, which gave it an expression, not of haughtiness nor of sternness, but of grave, condescending dignity. His dress was a rich hunting suit, which might well become a nobleman of the day, consisting of a green pourpoint laced with gold and slashed on the breast, long white hose half covered his boots, and a short green cloak not descending to his horse's back. His hat was of velvet, and the broad brim slightly turned up round it, and cut in various places so as somewhat to resemble a moral crown, while from the front, thrown over to the back, fell a splendid plume of ostrich feathers which almost reached his shoulder. His only arms appeared to be a dagger in his girdle, and a long heavy sword, which hung from his shoulder in a baldric of cloth of gold. The other stranger was habited nearly like the first, very little difference existing either in the fashion or the richness of their apparel. Both also were tall and vigorous men, and both were in the prime of their days. But the countenance of the second was very different from that of his companion. In complexion he was fair, with small blue eyes and rather sandy hair, nor would he have been otherwise than handsome, had it not been for a certain narrowness of brow and wideness of mouth, which gave a gaunt and eager expression to his face, totally opposed to the grand and open countenance of the other. As we have said, when his horse had done drinking, the first traveller turned towards the spot where Sir Osborne stood, and seemed to listen for a moment. At length he said, "Hear you the hunt now, Count William?" "No, your highness," replied the other. "It has swept away towards Ayr." "Then, sir," replied the first, "we are alone." And drawing his sword from the scabbard, he laid it level before his companion's eyes, continuing abruptly, "What think you of that blade? Is it not a good one?" At the same time he fixed his eye upon him with a firm, remarking glance, as if he would have read into his very soul. The other turned as pale as death, and faltered something about its being a most excellent weapon. "Then," continued the first, "I will ask you, Sir Count, should it not be a bold man, who, knowing the goodness of this sword, and the strength of this arm, and the stoutness of this heart, would yet attempt anything against my life? However, Count William of Furstenberg, let me tell you, that should there be such a man in this kingdom, and should he find himself alone with me in a wild forest like this, and fail to make the attempt he meditated, I should look upon him as a coward as well as traitor, and fool as well as villain." And his dark eye flashed as if it would have struck him to the ground. Count William faltered, trembled, and attempted to reply, but his speech failed him; and striking his hand against his forehead, he shook his bridle rein, dug his spurs into his horse's sides, and darted down the road like lightning. "Slave!" cried the other, as he marked him go, "cowardly slave!" And turning his horse, without further comment he rode slowly on the other way. Chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Darnley by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 33. The battle fares like to the morning's war, when dying clouds contend with growing light. Shakespeare. Thine is th' adventure, thine the victory, well as thy fortune turned the die for thee. Dryden. Sir Osborne immediately turned into the forest, and rousing his companions, called them to horse. But, however, though confessedly the hero of our story, we must leave him for a little time, and follow the traveller we have just left upon the road. For a considerable way he rode on musing, and if one might judge from his countenance, his meditations were somewhat bitter, such as might become the bosom of a king on finding the treachery of the world, the hollowness of friendship, the impossibility of securing affection, or any other of the cold lessons which the world will sometimes teach the children of prosperity. At length he paused, and, looking to the declining sun, saw the necessity of hastening his progress; whereupon, setting spurs to his horse, he galloped along the road without much heeding in what direction it led him, till, coming to one of those openings called carrefours by the French, where a great many roads met, he stopped to consider his farther route. In the midst, it is true, stood a tall post, which doubtless in days of yore pointed out to the inquisitive eye the exact destination to which each of the several paths tended. But old Time, who will be fingering everything that is nice and good, from the loveliest feature of living beauty to the grandest monument of ancient art, had not spared even so contemptible a thing as the finger-post, but, like a great mischievous baby, had scratched out the letters with his pocket-knife, leaving no trace of their purport visible. The traveller rode round it in vain, then paused and listened, as if to catch the sound of the distant hunt. But all was now silent. As a last resource, he raised his hunting horn to his lips, and blew a long and repeated call. But all was hushed and still. Even babbling echo, in pure despite, answered not a word. He blew again, and had the same success. There was an ominous sort of quietness in the air, which, joined with the sultriness of the evening, the expecting taciturnity of the birds, and some dark heavy clouds that were beginning to roll in lurid masses over the trees, gave notice of an approaching storm. Some road he must choose, and calculating as nearly as he could by the position of the sun, he made his election, and spurred along it with all speed. A dropping sound amongst the green leaves, however, soon showed that the storm was begun, and once having commenced, it was not slow in following up its first attack. The rain came down in torrents, so as to render the whole scene misty, and the lightning, followed by its instant peal of thunder, flickered on every side with flash after flash, dazzling the traveller's sight, and scaring his horse by gleaming across his path, while the inky clouds overhead almost deprived them of other light. In vain he every now and then sought some place of shelter, where the trees seemed thickest. The verdant canopy of the leaves, though impervious to the summer sun, and a good defence against a passing shower, were incapable of resisting a storm like that, and wherever he turned, the rain poured through in torrents, and wet him to the skin. Galloping on then, in despair of finding any sufficient covering, he proceeded for nearly half an hour along the forest road, before it opened into the country; and where it did so, instead of finding any nice village to give him rest, and shelter, and food, and fire, the horseman could distinguish nothing but a wide bare expanse of country, looking dismal and desolate in the midst of the grey deluge that was falling from the sky. About 7 or 8 miles farther on, he could, indeed, see faintly through the rain the spire of some little church, giving the only sign of human habitation, except where, to the left, in the midst of the heath that there bordered the forest, he perceived the miserable little hut of a charcoal burner, with a multitude of black hillocks before the door, and a large shed for piling up what was already prepared. To this, then, as the nearest place of shelter, the stranger took his way, very different in appearance from what he had been in the morning. His rich dress soaked and soiled, his velvet hat out of all shape or form, his high plume draggled and thin, with all the feather adhering closely to the pen; and, in short, though still bearing the inalienable look of a gentleman, yet in as complete disarray of apparel as the very worst wetting can produce. Without ceremony he rode up to the door, sprang off his horse, and entered the cabin, wherein appeared a good woman of about 40, busily piling up with fresh fuel a fire of dry boughs, over which hung a large pot of soup for the evening meal. The traveller's tale was soon told, and the dame readily promised him shelter and food, in the name of her husband, who was absent, carrying charcoal to the distant village. and seeing that the storm was likely to last all night, he tied his horse under the shed, placed himself by the side of the fire, aided the good woman to raise it into a blaze, and frankly prepared to make himself as comfortable as circumstances would permit. Well pleased with his easy good humour, the good dame soon grew familiar, gave him a spoon to skim the pot, while she fetched more wood, and bade him make himself at home. In a short time, the husband himself returned, as dripping as the traveller had been, and willingly confirmed all that his wife had promised. Only casting himself without ceremony into the chair where the stranger had been sitting, and which, by the way, was the only chair in the place, all the rest of the seats being joint stools, he addressed him familiarly, saying, "I take this place by the fire, my good gentleman, because it is the place where I always sit, and this chair because it is mine, and you know the old proverb, by right and by reason, whatever betide, a man should be master by his own fireside." "Faith, you are in the right," cried the traveller, laughing, "so I will content myself with this settle. But let us have something for supper, for, on the word of a knight, my ride has taught me hunger." "Give us the soup, dame," cried the charcoal burner. "Well I wot, sir traveller, that you might be treated like a prince, here on the edge of the wood, did not those vile forest laws prevent a poor man from spearing a boar as well as a rich one. In truth, the king is to blame to let such laws last." "Faith, and that is true," cried the traveller, "and heartily to blame too, if his laws stand between me and a good supper. Now would I give a link of this gold chain for a good steak of wild boar pork upon those clear ashes." The cottager looked at his wife, and the cottager's wife looked at her husband, very like two people undecided what to do. "Fie now!" cried the stranger. "Fie, good dame! I will wager a gold piece against a cup of cold water, that if I look in that coffer, I shall find wherewithal to mend our supper." "Ha, ha, ha!" roared the charcoal burner. "Thou hast hit it. Faith, thou hast hit it. There it is, my buck, sure enough. Bring it forth, dame, and give us some steaks. But mind," he continued, laying his finger on his lip, with a significant wink, "mind, mum's the word. Never fare well and cry roast beef." "Oh, I am as close as a mouse," replied the stranger in the same strain. "Never fear me. Many a stout stag have I overthrown in the king's forests, without asking your leave, or by your leave of any man." "Ha, ha, ha!" cried the cottager. "Thou'rt a brave one. Come, let us be merry while the thunder rolls without. It will strike the king's palace sooner than my cottage, though we are eating wild boar therein." In such sort of wit passed the evening till nightfall, and the storm still continuing in its full glory, the traveller was fain to content himself with such lodging as the cottage afforded for the night. Though his dress bespoke a rank far higher than their own, neither the cottager nor his wife seemed at all awestruck or abashed, but quietly examined the gold lacing of his clothes, declared it was very fine, and seemed to look upon him more as a child does upon a gilded toy than in any other light. When night was come, the good dame strewed out one corner of the hut with a little straw, piled it high with dry leaves, and the stranger, rolling up his cloak for a pillow, laid it under his head, stretched himself on the rude bed thus prepared, and soon fell into a profound sleep. Taking advantage of his nap, we will now return to Sir Osborne, who with all speed roused his companions from their slumbers, and bade them mount and follow. With military alacrity, Longpole was on his horse in a moment, and ready to set out. But, for his part, the young Hainaulter yawned and stretched, and, somewhat bewildered, looked as if he would fain have asked whither the knight was going to lead him. A word, however, from Longpole hurried his motions, and both were soon upon the track of Sir Osborne, who was already some way on the little bridle path by which they had arrived at the grassy mound where they had been sleeping. When he reached the road they had formerly left, he paused and waited their coming up. "Now, Longpole," cried he, "give me your judgment. Does this road lead to any crossing or not? Quick, for we must not waste a moment." "Most certainly it does, my lord," replied the shield bearer; "most probably to the spot where they all meet in the heart of the wood." "Perhaps he may tell us with more certainty," said the knight; and changing his language to French, for the ear of the young Hainaulter, he asked the same question. "Oh, yes, certainly," replied Frederick. "It leads to the great carrefour. I have hunted here 100 times." "Then are we on French ground or Flemish?" demanded the knight. "The French claim it," replied the youth; "but we used to hunt here in their despite." "Quick, then, let us on," cried Sir Osborne, "and keep all your eyes on the road before, to see if any one crosses it." "He has something in his head, I'll warrant," said Longpole to their new companion, as they galloped after Sir Osborne. "Oh, our lord knows the trade of war, and will snuff you out an enemy, without ever seeing him, better than a beagle dog with bandy legs and a yellow spot over his eyes." "Halt!" cried the knight, suddenly reining in his horse as they came within sight of the carrefour we have already mentioned. "Longpole, keep close under that tree. Frederick, here by my side. Back him into the wood, my good youth. That will do. Let every one keep his eyes upon the crossing, and when you see a horseman pass, mark which road he takes. How dark the sky is growing! Hark! is that not a horse's feet?" They had not remained many minutes when the cavalier we have spoken of earlier at the carrefour examined in vain the finger post, sounded his horn once or twice, as we have described, and then again took his way to the left. "Whither does that road lead?" demanded the knight, addressing the young Hainaulter. "It opens out on the great heath between the forest and Lillers, my lord," answered Frederick. "Is there any village, or castle, or house near?" asked Sir Osborne quickly. "None, none," replied Frederick. "It is as bare as my hand. Perhaps a charbonnier's cottage, or so," he added, correcting himself. "Let us on, then," replied the knight. "We are going to have a storm, but we must not mind that;" and putting his horse into a quick pace, he led his followers upon the track of the traveller, taking care never to lose sight of him entirely, and yet contriving to conceal himself whenever any turn of the road might have exposed him to the view of the person he pursued. The rain poured upon his head, the lightning flashed upon his path, but still the knight followed on without a moment's pause, till he had seen the traveller take refuge in the cottage of the charcoal burner. Then, and not until then, he paused, spurred his horse through some thick bushes on the edge of the wood, and obtained as much shelter as the high beeches of the forest could afford. Nor did he pause at the first or the thickest trees he came to, but took particular pains to select a spot where, though concealed by a high screen of underwood, they could yet distinguish clearly the door of the hut through the various breaks in the branches. Here, having dismounted with his followers, he stationed Frederick at a small opening, to watch the cottage, while he and Longpole carefully provided for the security and refreshment of the horses, as far as circumstances would admit, although the long forest grass was the only food that could be procured for them, and the storm still continued pouring through the very thickest parts of the wood. To obviate this, the knight and his shield bearer plied the underwood behind them with their swords, and soon obtained a sufficient supply of leafy branches to interweave with the lower boughs of the trees overhead, and thus to secure themselves against the rain. While thus employed, Frederick gave notice, as he had been commanded, that some one approached the cottage, which proved to be the charbonnier himself, returning with his mule; and after his arrival, their watch remained undisturbed by the coming of any visitor till nightfall. As soon as it was dark, Sir Osborne allotted to his followers and to himself the portion of the night that each was to watch, taking for his own period the first 4 hours, after which Longpole's turn succeeded, and lastly, towards morning, came the young Hainaulter's. With his eye fixed upon the light in the cottage, and his ear eager for every sound, Sir Osborne passed the time till the flame gradually died away, and, flashing more and more faintly, at last sank entirely. However, the dark outline of the hut was still to be seen, and the ear had now more power, for the storm had gradually passed away, and the only sounds that it had left were the thunder rolling faintly round the far limits of the horizon, and the dropping of the water from the leaves and branches of the forest. Towards midnight, Sir Osborne roused Longpole, and recommending him to watch carefully, he threw himself down by the young Hainaulter and was soon asleep. Somewhat tired with the fatigues of the day, the knight slept soundly, and did not wake till Frederick, who had replaced Longpole on the watch, shook him by the arm, and starting up, he found that it was day. "Hist, hist, my lord!" cried the youth. "Here are Shoenvelt and his party." Sir Osborne looked through the branches in the direction the young man pointed, and clearly distinguished a party of 7 spearmen, slowly moving along the side of the forest, at about 500 yards' distance from the spot where they lay. "It is Shoenvelt's height and form," said the knight, measuring the leader with his eye, "and that looks like Wilston by his side. But how are you sure?" "Because I know the arms of both," replied Frederick. "See, they are going to hide in the wood, close by the high road from Lille to Ayr." As he spoke, the body of horsemen stopped, and one after another disappeared in the wood, convincing Sir Osborne that the young Hainaulter was right. "Then nerve your arm and grasp your lance, Frederick," said the knight with a smile; "for if you do well, even this very day you may win your golden spurs. Wake Longpole there. We must all be prepared." The youth's eyes gleamed with delight, and snatching up his casque, he shook Longpole roughly, and ran to tighten his horse's girths, while Sir Osborne explained to the yeoman that they were upon the eve of an encounter. "Odds life!" cried Longpole, "I'm glad to hear it, my lord. I find it vastly cold sleeping in a steel jacket, and shall be glad of a few backstrokes to warm me. You say there are 7 of them. It's an awkward number to divide, but you will take 3, my lord. I will do my best for 2 1/2, and then there will be 1 1/2 for Master Frederick here. We could not leave the poor youth less, in honesty, for I dare say he is as ready for such a breakfast as we are." The bustle of preparation now succeeded for a moment or two, and when all was ready, and the whole party once more on horseback, the knight led the way to a gap, from whence he could issue out upon the plain without running the risk of entangling his horse in the underwood. Here, stationing himself behind the bushes to the left, he gave orders to Longpole and Frederick not to stir an inch, whatever they saw, till he set the example; and then grasping his lance, he sat like marble, with his eyes fixed upon the cottage. In about a quarter of an hour the door of the hut opened, and the cottager, running to the shed, brought up the traveller's horse. By this time he seemed to have discovered that his guest was of higher rank than he imagined, for when the stranger came forth, he cast himself upon his knees, holding the bridle, and remained in that situation till the other had sprung into the saddle. Dropping some pieces of gold into his host's hand, the traveller now shook his rein, and putting his horse into an easy pace, took his way over the plain, at about 300 yards' distance from the forest, proceeding quietly along, totally unconscious of danger. A moment, however, put an end to his security, for he had not passed above 100 yards beyond the spot where the knight was concealed, when a galloping of horse was heard, and Shoenvelt's party, with levelled lances and horses in charge, rushed forth from the wood upon him. In an instant Sir Osborne's visor was down, his spear was in the rest, and his horse in full gallop. "Darnley! Darnley!" shouted he, with a voice that made the welkin ring. "Darnley to the rescue! Traitor of Shoenvelt, turn to your death!" "Darnley! Darnley!" shouted Longpole, following his lord. "Sir George for Darnley! Down with the traitors!" The shout was not lost upon either Shoenvelt or the traveller. The one instantly turned, with several of his men, to attack the knight. The other, seeing unexpected aid at hand, fell back towards Darnley, and with admirable skill and courage defended himself, with nothing but his sword, against the lances of the marauders, who, their object being more to take him living than to kill him, lost the advantage which they would have otherwise had by his want of armour. Like a wild beast, raging with hate and fury, Shoenvelt charged towards the knight, his lance quivering in his hand, with the angry force of his grasp. On bore Sir Osborne at full speed towards him, his bridle in his left hand, his shield upon his breast, his lance firmly fixed in the rest, and levelled in such a manner as to avoid its breaking. In a moment they met. Shoenvelt's spear struck Sir Osborne's shield, and aimed firmly and well, partially traversed the iron. But the knight, throwing back his left arm with vast force, snapped the head of the lance in twain. In the meanwhile, his own spear, charged at the marauder's throat with unerring exactness, passed clean through the gorget piece and the upper rim of the corslet, and came bloody out at the back. You might have heard the iron plates and bones crunch as the lance rent its way through. Down went Shoenvelt, horse and man, borne over by the force of the knight's course. "Darnley! Darnley!" shouted Sir Osborne, casting from him the spear, which he could not disengage from the marauder's neck, and drawing his sword. "Darnley! Darnley to the rescue! Now, Wilston, now!" And turning, galloped up to where the traveller, with Longpole and Frederick by his side, firmly maintained his ground against the adventurers. Wilston's lance had been shivered by Longpole, and now, with his sword drawn on the other side of the mêlée, he was aiming a desperate blow at the unarmed head of the traveller, who defended himself from a spearman in front. But at that moment the knight charged the adventurer through the midst, overturning all that came in his way, and shouting loud his battle cry, to call his adversary's attention, and divert him from the fatal blow which he was about to strike. The plan succeeded. Wilston heard the sound, and seeing Shoenvelt dead upon the plain, turned furiously on Darnley. Urging their horses between all the others, they met in the midst, and thus seemed to separate the rest of the combatants, who, for a moment or two, looked on inactive, while the swords of the two champions played out each other's heads, and sought out the weaker parts of their harness. Both were strong and active and skilful, and though Sir Osborne was decidedly superior, it was long before the combat appeared to turn in his favour. At length, by a quick movement of his horse, the knight brought himself close to the adventurer's side, and gaining a fair blow, plunged the point of his sword through his corslet into his bosom. At that moment, the combat having been renewed by the rest, one of the marauders struck the knight from behind so violently on the head that it shook him in the saddle, and breaking the fastenings of his helmet, the casque came off and rolled upon the plain. But the blow was too late to save Wilston, who now lay dead under his horse's feet, and Sir Osborne well repaid it by a single backstroke at his new opponent's thigh. By this time only two of the marauders remained on horseback, so well had Longpole, the traveller, and Frederick done their devoir, and these two were not long in putting spurs to their steeds and flying with all speed, leaving the knight and his companions master of the field. Looking round, however, Sir Osborne missed the gallant young Hainaulter, while he saw his horse flying masterless over the plain. "Where is Frederick?" cried the knight, springing to the ground. "By my knighthood, if he be dead, we have bought our victory dear." "Not dead, monsieur, but hurt," said a faint voice near, and turning, he beheld the poor youth fallen to the earth, and leaning on one arm, while with the other he was striving to take off his casque, from the bars of which the blood dripped out fast upon the greensward. Darnley hastened to his aid, and having disencumbered him of his helmet, discovered a bad wound in his throat, which, however, did not appear to him to be mortal, and Longpole, with the stranger, having dismounted and come to his aid, they contrived to staunch the bleeding which was draining away his life. When this was done, the noble traveller turned towards Darnley. "Sir knight," said he, with the calm, dignified tone of one seldom used to address an equal, "how you came here, or why, I cannot tell, but it seems as if heaven had sent you on purpose to save my life. However that may be, I will say thank of you, and never did a more famous knight wield sword, and therefore, as the best soldiers in Europe may be proud of such a companion, let me beg you to take this collar till I can thank you better." And he cast over the knight's neck the golden chain of the order of St. Michael, with which he was decorated. "As for you, good squire," he continued, addressing Longpole, "you are worthy of your lord, therefore kneel down." "Faith, your worship," answered the yeoman. "I never knelt to any man in my life, and never will to any but a king, while I'm in this world." "Fie, fie, Hartley!" cried Sir Osborne. "Bend your knee. It is the king, man. Do you not understand? It is King Francis." "Oh, that changes the case," cried Longpole. "I crave your highness's pardon. I did not know your grace." And he bent his knee to the king. Francis drew his sword and laid it on the yeoman's shoulder. Then striking him 3 light blows, he said, "In the name of God, our Lady, and Saint Denis, I dub thee knight. Avance, bon chevalier. Noble or not noble, from this moment I make you such." Longpole rose, and the king turned to the young Hainaulter, who, sitting near, and supporting himself by his sword, had looked on with longing eyes. "No one of my gallant defenders must be forgotten," said Francis. "Knighthood, my good youth, will hardly pay your wound." "Oh, yes, yes!" cried Frederick eagerly. "Indeed it will, your highness, more than repay it." "Then be it so," replied the king, knighting him. "However, remember, fair knights, that Francis of France stints not here his gratitude, or you may think him niggard of his thanks. We will have you all go with us, and we will find better means to repay your timely aid. I know not, sir," he continued, turning to Sir Osborne, and resuming the more familiar first person singular, "whether I heard your battle cry aright, and whether I now see the famous Lord Darnley, the Knight of Burgundy, who, in wars now happily ended, often turned the side of battle in favour of the emperor." Sir Osborne bowed his head. "Then, sir," continued Francis, "I will say, that never did monarch receive so much injury or so much benefit from the hand of one noble adversary." CHAPter 34